Hey everybody, it's Will from the Back 40 and I hope you had an incredibly happy Thanksgiving. Today, I want to tell you a story. And this is a story that occurred before I was even born. But it's an important story. And I hope you'll give me the courtesy of listening all the way through because there's an allegory in this story that applies to rural America today. And heck, even if you listen all the way through, you're going to get to hear a good story and you might learn a lesson or two. Now, before I was born, my grandfather purchased the farm that I eventually grew up on. And my grandfather, this guy over my shoulder that you guys always say looks like Walt Disney, was an incredible man. Not only did he serve in World War II with distinguished service, he stayed in the military and served in the Air Force and retired after a stellar 20-year career. And after that, he did what a lot of World War II veterans did. He started a second career back here in the United States once he got home. And he retired from 20 years working for a company called Fasco Industries in Ozark, Missouri as a warehouse manager. Now, along with working two full 20-year careers that he was able to retire from, my grandfather also purchased the farm that I eventually grew up on. And on that farm, in order to make a little bit of extra money, he raised cattle. Now, my grandfather, working a full-time job in management in Ozark, Missouri, couldn't make the drive every day to the farm in Brighton, Missouri, which was about 45 miles away, to feed the cattle that he purchased. So he did what a lot of people do. I've done it, and many of you who raise cattle in rural America have probably done the same thing. He hired a friend who lived down the road from the farm to take care of the cattle for him on a day-to-day basis. And then my grandfather, every weekend or maybe every other weekend, would drive up to the farm to check on the cattle himself. Now, I want to say right up front that my grandfather didn't hire this man willy-nilly. He told me many times when he would tell this story over the years that this was a man that he trusted. They had spent time together. My grandfather, when he had made the decision to purchase the farm, had been invited to this gentleman's house on multiple occasions, and they'd built up a relationship. So when my grandfather gave him the job, it was based on that short-term trust that had been built up in their friendship that they had built since my grandfather purchased the farm. And in the beginning of the relationship, things went really well. My grandfather allowed this person not only to take care of the cattle, but over time they built up a trust and he began letting this friend take his cattle to market to sell them as well. Now, you probably already know where this story is going to go, but I hope you'll stick with me to the end because I want to tie it in to what's happening in rural America today. Now, one other thing I want to tell you about my grandfather is this. My grandfather had pride in his decision making. In other words, he took pride in the fact that before he made a decision, he thought through it and considered it very well. He thought of every outcome. He thought of everything that might impact the decision. And in the end, that's what led him to have faith and trust in people to carry out the acts that he asked them to carry out for the salary that he paid them. And in this situation, it was no different. My grandfather felt like he had hired the right man, and he felt like he could trust the man that he hired. But over time, my grandfather started to notice something. When he would visit the farm on weekends or every other weekend, and he would count cattle, that's something all of us cattle raisers have done on a regular basis, he started to know that there were small numbers of cattle starting to disappear. Maybe it would be one or two calves over the course of a month. Eventually, it might be a couple of calves and a cow. And when he would drive around our 600-acre farm to try to find the carcasses of these animals in the event that they had passed away of natural causes or been the victims of predators, he was never able to find these carcasses. Now, my grandfather, being trustworthy to a flaw, just like me, never put two and two together in his head in the beginning. He never thought that the person that he had hired, who he had trusted to do a specific job, might have lied to him, that he might have broken that trust, and that he might be the person that was causing harm to my grandfather's farm and harm to my grandfather's bottom line. Then something else began to happen over time. As my grandfather visited the farm on a regular basis and stayed there during vacation and on long weekends, he started to build friendships with other people that lived near the farm. There was a really well-known psychologist that had a farm next door that built up a great friendship with my grandfather. My grandfather had sold off some acreage to his sister and brother-in-law, and they began living on that farm full-time. And they began to see what was happening on the farm when my grandfather wasn't there. And that's when they began, after a year or two, telling stories to my grandfather about strange things that they had seen. Times outside of when cattle were normally supposed to be taken to market, when they saw this person that my grandfather had hired loading up just a couple of cow-calf pairs and taking them off to the sale barn to be sold. Well, they never doubted what was happening. They never had called my grandfather because they thought maybe he had just arranged it with the person he hired. But as my grandfather began to tell stories about cattle that were disappearing, all of the neighbors around the farm who were friends with my grandfather began telling my grandfather what they were seeing. But even then, I've got to tell you, in the beginning, my grandfather didn't want to believe what both he and other people were seeing with their own eyes. He just didn't want to believe that the person that he had taken due diligence to hire, that he had built up a friendship with over time, and that he had placed his trust in, would stab him in the back like that. And in the end, it resulted in my grandfather keeping him on in his role for much longer than he should have. Because after everything was said and done, this man, who was my grandfather's friend, who my grandfather had placed his trust in, was stealing cattle from my grandfather, to the degree that up to 50 head had been stolen over the course of just a couple of years. And in that day, that was a lot of money. Now, when my grandfather used to tell me this story later on in life, he used to look down at his boots whenever he would tell the story, and I could tell that there was a certain level of embarrassment there. Because even when my grandfather found out that this person was stealing cattle from him, he was slow to act in letting him know that he knew. He didn't want the embarrassment of having to admit that he was wrong, that he had hired somebody that couldn't be trusted, even though it was my grandfather who had been misled. It was my grandfather who had been lied to. It was my grandfather who had been fed the line of bull. He was a proud man. After all, he had served his country for 20 years in the military as an officer. He had led other men. He had made critical decisions that were important to his unit, etc. And he just didn't want to admit that he had been bamboozled. And I get it. I've been there myself. When I had to close my large company just a few years ago, there was a part of me that didn't want to admit that I had trusted a big company and somebody that worked for that company that I had known for over 20 years, to the point where they had made decisions that were harmful to me, to my family, and to the people that worked for me. But in the end, the truth is the truth. And no matter how difficult it is, we have to face the reality that we've been lied to and that those lies have hurt us personally. And that's the conclusion that my grandfather finally reached. And he fired the person that he had hired. Now, he didn't turn him into the law because he knew this man's wife, he knew his children, he knew the man's grandchildren, and he didn't want them to have to suffer the fate based on the decisions that this man had made to steal from my grandfather. And the allegory is this: we're doing the same thing in rural America with Donald Trump. Even though up to 40% of us in rural America didn't vote for Donald Trump, the majority of us did. We hired him to do a specific job, and that was to meet the commitments that he made during his campaign. And he's not met those commitments. Not only do we know that in our gut, but people around us have been telling us the same thing. I want you to think about the alternatives here. Either what we're being told by the experts that we've always trusted in this country, either they're lying and they've all engaged together, Democrat, Republican, independent, at all different levels of government, all different levels of science, and all different levels of agriculture education. Either they're all engaged in a giant cabal to mislead us into believing that this man is an incompetent president who's bad for rural America, or the truth is the same lesson that we have to learn, the lesson that my grandfather learned, that the trust that we placed in a man to do right by rural America was a misfounded trust. We were misled, he lied to us, and now it's time to make a change. So over the next few days, I'm going to be telling the story about how Donald Trump turned his back on rural America, how he lied to us, how he misled us. And even though I didn't vote for Donald Trump, I say us because in rural America, we're all in this boat together. Rural America is dying. And if we want to save it, we've got to save it together. So stay tuned, more to come.